group formation is so integral to this film, and I think in some ways what Alex was talking about and what Maria is talking about really resonates with some of the things that I came across as I was looking into this. I'm not going to give a big hour-long lecture, you can all rest assured, but I do want to frame the conversation with 3 video clips to kind of set the stage, and then I'd like to turn it over more to you all to kind of, I'm really interested to hear your comments and your observations, and people will probably have different interpretations, and it'll be interesting to kind of share ideas and see what came out for you from this film. I am going to stop after each clip and have a little brief conversation, and then maybe we can have a bit of a longer conversation at the end. It may not take a whole hour, we'll just kind of play it by ear. The first clip, so the first person, as I mentioned, I asked 20 people to give this talk, and none of them did it. But the first person I asked was Phil Zimbardo. And I don't know if you've heard of him, his clip was one of the ones that I sent out to you. He ran the Stanford Prison experiment in the 70s, which you may or may not have heard of. But basically what he did was he took a bunch of college students and made half of them prisoners and half of them guards, and within 5 days they were doing sort of Abu Ghraib style torments on one another. And then he later, actually kind of much later, he wrote a book called The Lucifer Effect, reflecting on that. And I saw him speak about the time of the Abu Ghraib scandals, and he didn't write about it for so long because he really just didn't want to think about it that much, because it was such a sort of traumatizing experience even for him as he looked back at it, and I think he sort of was ashamed of how he acted in that experiment as well. So he gave a TED Talk, which is the clips that I'm going to be showing you. You may have already watched it from the links that I sent out. I'm not going to show the whole thing. I'm going to show 2 different clips, and we can kind of stop and talk about what he's saying. Because it is in the context of Abu Ghraib and his experiment, a lot of it is in the context of institutional power. But I think his idea of this slippery slope of evil resonates with some of the things that happen in the film as well. And so in this first clip, I'm going to show you, and again, this is in the context of Abu Ghraib, so I think most of you are old enough to remember the kind of commentary that was coming out of that. And there were people who were saying it was bad apples, and there were people who were saying it was a bad barrel. And then he says, well, what about the bad barrel makers? So those are the kind of things he's talking about in this particular clip, which hopefully will go off without a trace, without any glitches here.
Shit boy. What was he doing in that prison rather than in some mental institution? In any event, here's former Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld. He comes down and says, I want to know who was responsible. Who are the bad apples? Well, that's a bad question. You have to reframe it.
Oh my goodness.
Because what could be the who of people, but it could also be the what of the situation. And obviously that's where I'm headed. So how do psychologists go about understanding such transformations of human character if you believe that they were good soldiers before they went down to that dungeon? There are 3 ways. The main way is what's called dispositional. We look at what's inside of the person, the bad apples. This is the foundation of all of social science, the foundation of religion, the foundation of war. Social psychologists like me come along and say, yeah, people are the actors on the stage, but you have to be aware of what the situation is. Who are the cast of characters? What's the costume? Is there a stage director? And so we're interested in what are the external factors around the individual, the bad barrel. And social scientists stop there, and they miss the big point that I discovered when I became an expert witness for Abu Ghraib. The power is in the system. The system creates a situation that corrupts the individual. The system is the legal, political, economic, cultural background. And this is where the power is of the bad barrel makers. So you want to change the person, you got to change the situation. You want to change the situation, you got to know where the power is in the system. So the Lucifer Effect involves understanding human character transformations with these 3 factors. And it's a dynamic interplay. What do the people bring into the situation? What does the situation bring out of them? And what is the system that creates and maintains that situation? So my book, The Lucifer Effect, recently published, is about how do you understand how good...
Okay, so I'm sorry that was not very loud. Were you guys able to hear it?
Yeah.
Okay. So the thing that I thought was interesting about this is, kind of the 2 quotes that I highlighted for you. What do the people bring to the situation? What does the situation bring out in them? And what is the system that creates and maintains that situation? So I think looking at the town or looking at the kids, looking at the town, looking at the outside factors affecting that town. I just thought it was an interesting, and I think some of the things that Maria was talking about too really contributes to that. Like, who contributes to the bad barrel in this film? And who can we identify who these bad barrel makers are? And I just wanted to see if you guys have any thoughts. What for you is part of the bad barrel that these kids, that is bringing out these actions in these kids? Yeah.
I'd like to contrast the authority figures. Say, let's take the police on one hand, who are trying to cover up, and then the coach on the other hand, saying, no, you guys, he constantly went back to that, being a man, and, what does it mean to do that? And there was something about his rhetoric that was saying, I've been trying to teach you, and this is what you go and do. Now, whether he is part of the bad barrel making, at least the way it was framed in the movie, it looked like he was a good barrel maker. And the other authority figures, on the other hand, seemed like the bad, they were the constructors or maintainers of that bad barrel by basically saying the rules of civil rights, the rules of human decency don't apply to you anymore, because this person is subhuman.
I didn't see the coach as the good, and I think my perception is different because I go back to that gender, masculinity and femininity. It's like, if you're gonna cry, go to your mama. Almost like there's this negative, perception in his mind of, there's, like, he looks down on weakness. And what they were doing was almost this mob mentality, beating up this undocumented immigrant. And they look at him as weaker, and killed him. And so I think the coach, from my perspective, I didn't think of him as one of the quote good guys, because of just that overemphasizing masculinity, and if you're going to be weak, go to your mamas, go home to mommy. If you're going to cry, go home to mommy. If you're going to, and I think that was for me, disturbing.
It's funny because I find him to be very ambivalent, so I'm somewhere in between both of you.
I wasn't sure if I thought if the coach was a good upstander or a bystander, and part of the reason why I came late, so I may have missed more, but he said be a man, but I wasn't sure what his definition of be a man was.
That's a good point.
So I wasn't sure if that was a good definition or one that I was in agreement with or not. But the other part is, on the plus side, oftentimes you may have heard recently of coaches that have been fired for calling guys faggots and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And he didn't do that. So I did note that. So I thought, okay, well, that's positive, that he wasn't calling them pussies or something like that.
And the one other thing I want to say in the coach's defense is he said you can't play when he came back. He said you cannot play. You're not acceptable for this team, even though he was one of his star players and he knew he was going to have a worse season. So again, that's like, I don't want to interject too much in that conversation, but I found him very ambivalent. Yeah.
I think the barrel makers are the people who decided that they would create an economy that benefited just a few, to the detriment of people across the country, to impoverishment of working people across the country. And so the perception, because most people, you could also say the barrel makers are the educational system that doesn't explain this. So people don't know why they're poor, and they therefore blame the other. They think there's a limited amount of resources, and anybody who comes in is going to take from them, rather than look to what creates that limited amount of resources. So that would be the barrel makers for me.
I would actually agree with both of you in terms of coach, in that there wasn't enough information in the documentary to say one way or another about them, except that the evidence of these football players who felt okay about using violence in their expression, which we cannot help but make a connection to football and the kind of cultural attitudes that's being sort of fostered in that experience. The thing that really got to me, and I missed the beginning part of the documentary, so maybe I missed it completely, but
Parking crisis.
what I didn't see is this educational institution doing anything about what happened. Where are the teach-ins? Where are they talking to the students about why this is wrong, or how did this come about? It was like the educational part was missing. Where are the teachers who would do something about this? I mean, how they react is part of the lesson. And what I saw in terms of reaction was that where were the reasonable voices? I mean, you heard them at the very, very end. You have this one teacher saying something, but there wasn't much of that in the documentary. So I don't know if it's because it was missing, or they just didn't show it. Or maybe these people are being quieted, in this kind of community.
One thing that I guess, I don't know to what extent, but it's a point that I want to bring out in terms of the bad barrel makers. One thing that I found very interesting throughout the documentary and through the parents that we saw speaking is it kind of surprised me how the parents of these boys, prove me wrong, but I did not hear one of them say, like, my child killed somebody, or my child was part of killing somebody. There was no admission to it. I don't know what the discipline was in their own households after this happened, but my perspective is, where is the raising of these 4 boys into taking responsibility for something you did? This was just one man and 4 boys. If this one man was, in some way harassing you, you felt that your life was in danger, I mean, come on. If it was 1-to-1, I would understand, but 4-to-1, now that's a different story. And I'm using this as a backdrop of my own raising. My parents would, you were one of 4 who killed a man. You will,
Own it.
say what you did. I don't care how old you are. And you will do justice, and you will apologize to this family. Even after the verdict was made, all of these, hurrahs about the victory, it's just very surprising. And then the 2 parents of the young boy that was followed very closely throughout the documentary, I'm like, come on. I mean, that's just, my perspective of, part of, maybe something is definitely, I don't know. I don't know if anybody else wants to comment about it, but it's just, come on. I mean, come on. Oh, Jesus. It just makes me want to really think about, how these 4 boys were raised. And what kind of, morals about social responsibility and about the value of a human being. That's just...
I see one of the barrel makers as the whole culture of sports itself, and how it can foster this sense of hating the other, the enemy, and so on. And I know it's been there since the time of the gladiators in the Roman Empire, but there is a lot of violence in our culture connected with sports. I just recently saw the film 42 about Jackie Robinson, and the taunting he receives from coaches, from players, it's just, it's hard for me to believe that was once taken for granted, that kind of racism, not so long ago in Major League Baseball. And I don't even consider baseball that violent a sport compared to football, but there's just something about the culture of sports that I think we have to be careful to not let that violence go astray.
I'm thinking bigger, not bigger, but that the barrel maker is the town, because a lot of the dialogue was, well, we've always called each other, John the Pollock, and so-and-so this, and so-and-so the WAP, whoever, and it's just this, and what it goes back to Dr. Saragosa is that, you know, there's hundreds of years of maybe in that area of our country of this Eurocentric worldview. And I think it was Patricia Nelson Limerick, historian, I think she's out of Colorado, but, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember the quote. She said something about the East Coast. It's you know, the 13 colonies in the East Coast, and the United States there was this idea of it is a melting pot and all these ethnic groups from Europe, but it resembles a family reunion. And there's not a lot of experience with people of color. So I'm looking at, it's back to, you know, this town of calling each other names, and it was just almost in jest. And then, you know, when you're an outsider, you are an outsider.
Well, I think it makes me think too that, as Maria said, nobody was welcomed with open arms when they came.
Did they interview a mayor? Was he a mayor or was it just city councilman that they talked about? He was the one that was talking about
Like
this is just the way, you know, this is our identity, is our background. We come from a mixed group.
I can't remember. Yeah, I think I know.
He's a mayor, right?
Yeah, the borough leader.
Talked about like the identity of the town being this is who we are, and they, you know, basically people have to that are coming in, you know, we're not used to it, and they have to adapt to us, or do we have to adapt to them?
I heard him say that, I thought what he was saying was that these people are scapegoating Hispanics, and that they didn't, that the economic situation brought about this sort of human need for scapegoating, not that it justified. I think he was saying, look, you know, they're being racist, but it's because of this economic situation that sort of added, I mean, that's what I got out of what he was saying.
You had your hand up?
Yeah, I want to agree with your comment about the whole town being the bad barrel, because it starts with kind of as like the joking, you're a WAP or you're a Polak, and so that resonates in people's minds. It's okay to call someone racial terms. Even to them, doesn't really sound that racial because they're all white. And so when like people of color come, they think it's okay, and they focus it on other people, and then it turns to hate. And also the fact that the town is an economically depressed town, where in most towns who have like a big source of economy leave, that money for schools education, it just leaves, and the quality of education, it being like a rural bubble, there's not many people coming in, so it's hard to really see what the real outside world was like because of it.
Yeah, thank you. Just these two, and then we'll move on to the next one.
I had like, you know, three thoughts. One was that I saw a few African American students early and later on, and then when the mother talks about they had a colored friend, and then okay, well, we're not even up with the current description here, but okay. But she was trying to like rationalize. I felt like she was trying to rationalize that, and therefore this couldn't have been intentional because after all, they had the colored friend. And then there's another point when one of the young men says, Dad walked out and meet the father figures are the police officers, and they turned out to be like all bad. I said, oh my Lord. And then there's one other thing. And then when the mother kept saying we're a happy family, I thought, okay, so you're trying to figure out what went wrong that you had your son doing this, but you're not admitting that anything went wrong. It's just those are my reactions.
I just have to say, as a teacher, I know a lot of parents who would never admit that anything was wrong with their child. Going by someone's comment from earlier.
My dad will pull me out of my BS any time of the day, multiple times of the day. And I am grateful for that because that makes me introspective, and that is the way I'm going to raise my children one day. Because that just makes you realize, you know, the steps that you walk in this life have consequences. And the lens that you have for yourself is the lens that you expect others to see you with, you know? So it makes you conscious in a way, and I mean, maybe it's because I'm an only child too.
I just teasing you. I definitely had that experience. I would think this, you in the blue there, and then let's go to the next section, and we'll have more time to talk.
I just wanted to say that
was one of the most honest ones. He demonstrated real growth through all of this. I mean, and he had been taken up and down. I mean, in the end, they all tried to blame him. And he was probably one of the least culpable. But when the interviewer was asking him if this was a white guy, would you have kicked him in the head? Because he did kick him in the head. He claimed he missed. But he's an athlete. Come on. I know he was drunk. But he said no. And I mean, I just saw this person is probably going to get out of this. Meaning, mentally, in his heart, he's growing. And it's just really sad for all of them. And they were all victims, you know, of the town. So there is going to be some serious, the ones that really did not pay, they're going to pay later.
And they did end up getting significant sentences. I'm not sure if they got overturned later, but they did in the federal. I just want to, just before I go on, the one thing that also resonated for me was just the whole Steubenville case. I found a lot of parallels there. Instead of race, it was gender, but some very similar kind of things happened there, I felt like.
And what the other thing about the Steubenville is how it was reported in the media and how the girl ended up being the one at fault as opposed to the football player.
Well, if he hadn't had come, never would have happened. So this next section, so I skip over some bits in the film that you sort of need to know about in this next section. I have to stay here. I keep forgetting. I need to stay by the microphone. So in this second clip, he talks about the Stanford prison experiment that he ran. And he also refers to something he talks about early in the clip, which is the Stanley Milgram experiment, which you probably have heard of, even if you don't recognize the name. It was the one where they wanted to see whether people obeyed authority and gave consecutively worse electric shocks to someone who was identified as a learner, who they were trying to see if it improved their memory. And they found that people did. 61% was the average, and study after study went to the maximum level that was like the triple X, you know, this is very dangerous, it said on the equipment, and they did it. And then in some follow-up studies, they found that when the people in the experiment saw another person like them giving the most severe shocks, 95% of them went along. And when someone else rebelled, only 5% went along. So this idea of sort of being passive participants who don't perhaps participate but don't say anything, and then when someone does say something, how that does change what other people in the situation do, is something that comes up in what he talks about here. So I'm just going to go ahead and play it, and I'm sorry it's so quiet, but we'll...
So this study, which I did with my graduate students, especially Craig Haney, we also began with an ad. We didn't have money, so we had a cheap little ad, but we wanted college students for studying prison life. 75 people volunteered, took personality tests, we did interviews, picked 24, most normal, most healthy, randomly assigned them to be prisoner foreign. So on day one, we knew we had good apples, but it wasn't a bad situation. And secondly, we know there's no difference between the boys who are going to be guarded and the boys who are going to be prisoners. The kids who are going to be prisoners who sit at home in the dormitories and study to begin Sunday. We didn't tell them that city police were going to come and do realistic arrests.
Want to do these screen capture CC so that we can read if we can't hear it. It's on the bottom. You click on the CC.
Police car pulls up in front, and a cop comes to the front door, knocks, and says he's looking for me. So they, right there, they took me out the door, they put my hands against the car. It was a real cop car, it was a real policeman, and there were real neighbors in the street who didn't know that I was, this was
terrible captions, but...
And there was cameras all around, neighbors all around. They put me in the car, then they drove me around Palo Alto.
I don't know if it's worth the captions, but.
The police station, the basement of the police station. Then they put me in a cell. I was the first one to be picked up, so they put me in a cell, which is just like a room with bars on it. You could tell it wasn't a real jail. They locked me in there in this degrading little outfit. They were taking this experiment too seriously.
Here are the prisoners who are going to be dehumanized. They're going to become numbers. Here are the guards with the symbols of power and anonymity. Guards get prisoners to clean their clothes out with their hands and do humiliating tasks. They strip them naked. They sexually clothe them. They begin to do degrading activities, like having them simulate sodomy. You saw simulating fellatio in Soldiers in Abu Ghraib. My guards did it in 5 days. The stress reaction was so extreme that all kids we picked because they were filthy had breakdowns within 36 hours. The study ended after 6 days because it was out of control. 5 kids had emotional breakdown. Doesn't make a difference if warriors go to battle, changing their appearance or not. Doesn't make a difference if they're anonymous and how they treat their victims. We know in some cultures they go to war, they don't change appearance. In other cultures they paint themselves like one of the flies. In some they wear masks. In many soldiers are anonymous in uniform. So with this anthropologist John Watson found 23 cultures that had 2 bits of data. Do they change their appearance? 15. Do they kill, torture, mutilate? 13. If they don't change their appearance, only 1 of 8 kills, torture, mutilate. The key is in the red zone. If they change their appearance, 12 of 13, that's 90%, kill, torture, mutilate. That's the power of anonymity. So what are the 7 social processes that grease the slippery slope of evil? Mindlessly taking the first small step. Dehumanization of others, de-individuation of self, diffusion of personal responsibility, blind obedience to authority, uncritical conformity to group norms, passive tolerance of evil through inaction or indifference.
Oh, I always miss right the part where I want that list to stay at. Ugh. Sorry.
Can you click on it? If you click on the image?
Let me see. I think I have it written on yours. Well, it's on your paper, so I guess we don't have to have it up there, although I think it's sort of, so 1653. But this was another place where I felt like a lot of these things, at least to me, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts, not all of these things were present in this town, in this film, but a lot of these things were present. And I'm curious to see which of these things you saw and in what context. And he calls these the slippery slope of evil. In the context he was talking about with the Stanley Milgram test, the first shock is very minor. The person doesn't even feel it. And then gradually they get worse and worse. So that's kind of what he's referring to in mindlessly taking the first step. So do you guys have any thoughts about this list and what's present in the film and the slippery slope of evil?
Because I used to be on a football team, and this is exactly like being trained at just like football practice. We obviously uniform, our coaches orders at us, we follow all the orders despite what they are, we do the plays, we just follow and become sort of, I guess, like anonymity. It's just like, it's just like being in the military. You just get broken down and then you become one single thing. You just lose kind of your identity, you just put it together.
Do you want to say something?
I'm going to be a little too tough on Scully here, but I think his effort was a little mindless at the first step because I was picking apart his words, and earlier on in the film he says something to the effect that when he first went in and lied for his friends, he was then told by his lawyer or whoever, listen, you are going to be charged with murder. I'm going to drop you as your lawyer. I'm not going to represent you. You're going to go to jail. And then he says, well, then I decided to
do the right thing. I thought that was an interesting juxtaposition too.
In the end, when he was asked about if it was a white person, would you have stopped? And I thought his excuse was a little weak when he said, well, he used the reason why he didn't stop on the Latino was because of a language barrier. If a white person on the ground was saying, no, no, stop, I would have stopped. So I think it was a mindless first step but I think that I just wasn't totally convinced in the sincerity of it all.
Yeah.
I think everybody's touching all the points that I think is so there, but I think it's also how institutionalization of, in this case, racism has become part of our culture. And so from the family, that family just shut down or through fear to say, even if I disagree, I won't say anything, because the normalization of whatever act becomes part of your culture, your normality. And so someone was mentioning, like, the games. So that culture of violence, how much we allow for us to accept that it's normal. So how much for us it's okay to say that it's okay to reject people or find scapegoats. So those kind of things that are like also fit into the moment. For example, in this case, the town was going into recession, and so we need, who is the guilty one? So we are okay. So someone has to be guilty here. And so finding those situations is easy in those kind of moments. Same happened in the Nazi times, in Germany. So I think it's how the process of normalization of something that is becomes something normal at the same time is against our humanity. That's for me the scary part, because all of us can become part of the whole situation.
And I just want to interject. There's one thing. The woman who used to be a cop, I think, in Philadelphia. I mean, it's just from her description, it sounded like she was really ostracized in the town for sticking up. I think she makes a comment sometime that if she hadn't been there to witness it, they would have just tossed his body over the fence or something like that. So she was the one who kind of stood up and said, hey, this is wrong, something needs to happen, and she definitely paid for it in the town.
And that's why Guantanamo is the same situation again, because it's so the ones who were committing the torture, they thought that it was okay. They were acting against the enemy. So they were there, and they are still there because they are the enemy. And so it was okay. So the chain of command never went into, never were asked why they were doing that or was that. So they have to find a guilty always.
Regarding the 7 point from Zimbardo there, I thought that one thing that's missing is like there was group think in terms of these boys, like if it was just a one-on-one encounter, most likely this would not have happened. Like one started a kick, there's a racial slur, and then everybody started to think about it. But I think someone already mentioned it. I think all in all, none of them thought that while we killed the person, it was like, oh, it's this, it's that, it's the town, it's economy, it's this or that. And I thought that what was most poignant is, the contrast between the village of Luis Ramirez, where everybody was crying, there were tears, and I didn't see that kind of emotion on the other part, because it was like, oh, yeah, nothing was wrong, they were whatever the other part of the group think of the town was. So I thought that, probably I'd like to have seen that as part of the point number 8 group think.
Well, I think also, Luis is saying maybe it's the passive toleration of evil. I also kind of think it might be that diffusion of personal responsibility. They were there with, however, 3 or 4 other friends, so their kick was maybe not the crucial kick, and maybe it wasn't so terrible, that there was someone else, and they're a little bit anonymous, and who's doing what. And I think those 2 points to me come out in what happened. Yeah.
I just wanted to respond to the earlier point about Scully's comment about language, and to me, I heard it slightly differently, which is, to me, dehumanization was just such a huge factor, and I guess what I heard in him saying he wouldn't have done it, blaming the language, was that language difference was part of the dehumanization that occurred, and in the othering of an ethnic group, an immigrant group that's coming in. And unlike the other groups, the WOCs or them, that this is a group that also has distinctively this language difference, and that's become, and we've seen it in propositions, English-only propositions in California and other states, that's an othering that's happened, and a way in any kind of othering can turn into that dehumanization. So I guess I wasn't, not to excuse Scully or his apology or not, or whatever, I think I heard when he talked about that, I heard that was the dehumanization piece for him.
I wasn't here for the whole film, but for the parts that I was here, every time that they were talking about Luis, the person who got killed, what I heard was illegal immigrant. So the word illegal was always there, so kind of in connection to language and what becomes normal in society. There was a small piece on NPR, and specifically the fact that in our debate and in the conversation, it's almost like, so language is really important, right? And terminology, and that gives, it's by putting illegal, it almost immediately, the conversation stops being about, here is another human being, it's about something, it's already the other.
I think too, that makes me think back to the who's making the barrel. I think there's a lot of people putting that language and much more extreme language out there, in the media that also, I think, to me, is part of the barrel. Yeah, barrel makers.
I think that typically football players are considered sort of the torchbearers of societal values in a way. I think maybe that's overstating, but they're considered like the good guys as opposed to like, the geeks or whatever, mainstream people. But they're also, in my impression is they're not doing anything that they would think was bad. And so it is my impression is they've probably heard this stuff at home. All kinds of, why don't they go back to their own country or whatever. And so it was, in a way, fine. That was probably why no one said, stop, because they were all acting on what they heard. It was all, a lot of them, to generalize, are not kind of out-of-the-box thinkers.
I just have a profound sense of sadness, because every time I hear this human being and so on, when are we going to have this conversation about them? When are we going to think of each of the hens locked in little cells and the little calves in little cages? When are we going to say these things in the context of other living creatures? God, how many thousands of years is it going to take? This is just, we've been talking about this for since human beings, I'm sure, have been thinking, but we're so unevolved in terms of compassion.
Yeah.
I just wanted to go back to the groupthink idea. I think that's a real key to the film and to this experiment. And it brings to mind another experiment, and I can't think of the name, but it was made into a play. It was a high school down in Palo Alto, where the teacher was, maybe somebody remembers the name.
Was it The Wave?
Oh, yes, yes. And actually at Mercy High School, the guy was there when we did the play and had a great discussion. But those kids were turned into fascists and their victims just through groupthink, just through belonging. And I remember a guy in the film here talking about being Lithuanian and how sad that the church was being taken down. And it was like, it's all about our group versus that group, And how can we get out of this? What kind of psychology gets us into this?
What a segue. Okay, we're going to go to the next one. Okay, so we're going to segue to the next thing. And again, it's probably going to be really quiet. But this was another, I don't know if you had a chance to watch this thing about intergroup bias, but one of the things I found that was interesting as I looked into this, in a way what Alex was talking about also brought this up, is this is just an incredibly common human thing. Humans form groups over the most random things. They've done experiments where people who use the same ATM machine and never see one another have a bond in some weird way, and it does impact them to a very minor extent. But people form groups, that's what they do. And then once they formed a group, then someone's not in the group, and that creates problems. So I'm going to play this clip, and then I guess one of the things that as I was putting these together is, this is the thing that people do. People form groups. And if you're in a group, there's someone who's not in your group, you prefer people in your group to people outside your group. Does this mean we're just automatically on the slippery slope of evil? Because every time you form a group, there's someone who's not quite as good as the people in your group. So those were the kind of things I was thinking about, and you can watch this and we can talk about it when it's over. And he talks quietly, so God, this is going to be...
Human beings are social animals. We depend on each other for survival. And as such, like all social animals, we tend to organize ourselves into groups. For humans, this group-based organization has certain psychological consequences. We tend to hold ideas or opinions about our own group and other groups. We tend to have certain feelings towards our own groups and towards other groups. And we tend to act in certain ways around and toward our own groups and other groups. In fact, it's a bit more interesting than that. Generally, humans tend to hold their own group in higher regard than other groups, like their own group more than other groups, and act more nicely toward their own groups than towards other groups. This was demonstrated by the famous Robbers Cave experiment conducted by Sharon and colleagues in 1954. The experimenters formed two groups of 11-year-old boys in isolation from each other for a period of 8 days, and then brought them into contact with each other under competitive conditions. The result was hostility between the groups, evident in their overt behavior, their evaluative ratings of each other, and their estimates of performance by group members during the competitive task. And if you're thinking, well, of course they found bias, the boys were competing with each other, you should be aware that even before any intergroup competition, when the groups were simply made aware of each other's existence, the mere knowledge of the presence of the other group was sufficient to generate name-calling and other derogatory commentary from each group directed toward the other. In a similar experiment, Doyes and colleagues randomly divided participants into X-type and Y-type based on a focus test. Even when the participants were led to anticipate no further interaction with members of either group, they rated members of their own group more positively than members of the other group. Bear in mind that these groups had no history, no variation in race, religion, gender, sexuality, or socioeconomic status. They had no reason to dislike each other and never expected to see or interact with each other again. And still, intergroup bias emerged in their interactions. How much more should we expect to find in between groups that actually matter to people? Does this mean we should throw up our hands in despair and give up on the hope of peaceful intergroup relations? Hardly. First, remember that groups are psychologically constructed, and as such, they can be psychologically altered, rearranged, and managed. Humans are much more complicated and interesting than a set of dots, or a pair of categories, and necessarily fit into a multitude of groups. For example, how do you feel about Christians? How do you feel about politicians? How about parents, black people, straight people, Americans, second-generation immigrants? How do you feel about this guy? What's immediately apparent is that you can't just add together your feelings about different groups to arrive at your feelings about a particular person. Some categories are very salient and important to you, while you don't think about certain others. And even when you do, they don't necessarily matter. Intergroup bias is largely about how we choose to define ourselves and others, and then how we choose to manage those constructed identities. That said, there's no denying that sometimes relationships between groups could use a little work. Fortunately, even when groups are well-defined or imposed on us externally, and even when intergroup relations aren't very good, there are tested, proven ways of improving intergroup relations. The one I research is called intergroup contact. If you'd like to learn about that, there's a link at the end of this video. Thanks for listening. I'm Dr. Keon West, social psychologist.
Blah, 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 blah. So, and again, I feel like I'm also sort of focused on all the doomy parts of it. They both have like their little happy things about how you can make this better. But I did I did think this section that I put here, you know, that people think more highly of people of their own group, they like their own group better, and they're nicer to people in their own group. And it doesn't matter what that group is based on. It could be based on, we like the Giants. It could be based on, I love your shoes. You know, it could be based on a lot of different things. And this is just something that people do kind of automatically. And another thing that struck me is, you know, in the Robbers Cave experiment, before the kids even meet each other, they start calling the other group names. And then it reminded me that's how this altercation started. Scully started calling Luis names, and then that sort of unleashed the thing. And I was thinking, is that the first step in the slippery slope? That small first step? Was that name calling? Is that how, you know, it kind of gets started and then goes from there? And then also this thing that that group members like each other better than other people. Is that the first step in dehumanization? That, you know, does that just play out that way? Can it be not played out that way? And then the other thing is, I mean, there's a lot of positive parts to being about a group. And, you know, in this town, I actually saw a lot of positive things in this town. I mean, I'm not a hunter, but, you know, I can see, like, these guys get together, they go hunting, it's great, you know, they're buddies, and it keeps those relationships going. And, you know, there's a lot of positive parts to that. There's a lot of positive parts to how the people stick together. I mean, that they have each other's back. That's a good thing. The bad thing is how they treat the people who are outside the group. So, and again, this was something that struck me as I watched the film, is like, how do you keep those good things? So that tight-knit, small town kind of, where you have a place and people know you and you have sort of mutual obligations, and how do you keep those good things without having these bad things about how you treat people outside your group? So those were just some of the things I was thinking about as I watched this. And also, how does this just group thing, how do you keep going from forming a group to sliding down the slippery slope of evil? So now I'm going to stop talking.
Well, you included in that list of articles a link to an article about a catastrophe in Alabama, and how groups that had not been mixing together, two ethnic groups, came together during this disaster and overcame that completely. So, and you know, I think, I'm an anthropology teacher, and so we look at people through all time, all history, everywhere, and we don't see selfishness and self-interest and group bias everywhere. It's not inevitable in us. And there's a whole, I'm sure many of you already, you know, are dealing with the kind of new body of research that's come out in the last 5 or 10 years about the natural inclination to empathy that we see in little children and even in our close primate relatives, even in monkeys and apes, that babies will try to share immediately, even rather than hoard. And we've been taught, I think, all the time, there's something really natural about selfishness, and there's something really natural about group otherizing the other group. Anthropologists don't think this really anymore. We think kind of differently. So I think, and we have a lot of evidence to the contrary.
Well, you know, this makes
that's hopeful, I think.
You know, if you have an article about that, I can send it out to the group as sort of a counterpoint.
I'll send you a couple of articles.
Yeah, that would be great.
I'd be glad to do that.
Yeah.
I was thinking the same thing in all of the pieces that you've shown us. And although I agree about sort of like the rural aspect of small town of Shenandoah, what I've seen is that much of what they're engaged in is this identity that they've created, and part of that identity that Alex was talking about in terms of like the machismo aspect, the violence, the sports, is part of who they are, and they're invested in that, and so to attack any one of them is to attack who they are as a people. And I think that was part of the problem of this sort of group identity. The identity is created, and I think part of it, and it goes to the first speaker today, Maria, I think it's partly because we live in a capitalist society, that capitalism is based on the idea of competition. The competition becomes so innate in our way of being and thinking and interacting with each other that it doesn't matter if we have no social interaction. If they're brought up in a capitalist society, they're already brought up to think about competing with one another, and because I don't think it's natural. I don't think it has to be natural and universal to be competitive. I also think that Americans tend to think in bipolar, extreme ways, that we can't really sort of skirt the gray areas. We want it black and white, you know, it's yes or no. And so when I look at one thing that I saw that this group say over and over again, and I don't think they're any different than any other small town or any big city. I think the vast majority of people will say, I am not racist. This is not racism. But what is racism? Do they have to be a self-proclaimed neo-Nazi white supremacist in order to be a racist or in order to engage in racism? These boys beat a person to death. And they did it with impunity, and then the reaction, this identity, them against us, was a racist reaction. But there's this denial, well, but I'm not a racist. I have a colored friend. And that's the part that I'm really sort of thinking about, and that is, you know, okay, so Shendo, it's not an exception. It's the way we all are. We haven't done a very good job of talking to ourselves, teaching our communities about what racism is. Because right now, unless it's Nazis, World War II, extermination, it's not racist. And that, I think, has a horrible implication in terms of, you know, our own world.
And I think one of the articles I sent around was by Jack Glazer, and it was sort of a summary of social psychology concepts. And one of the things he talks about is that so much of it is not conscious. It's unconscious. People don't mean to do it. They don't think they're doing it. And they're sort of, they have some self-worth tied into not doing it. So they don't want to admit it if it's pointed out to them. And so it makes it a tricky, you know, once you're past, like, okay, a Jim Crow law or something like that, once it gets trickier because a lot of it is unconscious. And I think
It's an internalized process. You know, it kind of said, she gave me some ideas when I was thinking about this us against them, the Shenandoah being this town, this is our town, and everybody else is an outsider. But then in that one scene, I think they took it to this national level where they, you know, emphasize God, where they're at that rally, and they say, you know, at the rally for these boys, and they sing God Bless America and go back where you came from. And so they take it on this national scale, like we're Americans and you're not. And it's, again, this us against them on a bigger scale as Americans. And yet it reminded me of some of my friends who are from South America who call themselves Americans because it's the Americas and they consider themselves Americans. So I think, you know, there's a distinction whether you're an American from the United States or American from a South American country. And yet these people at this rally don't see that those similarities or that relationship, and they put that us against them on a, you know, grander scale, and then they sing God Bless America, and then I remember the church being demolished, and you know, just this idea of Christian values. Well, where's your Christianity when you're killing a young father, you know, just because he's brown?
But they didn't see him.
Right.
They didn't see him.
No, they
as a
don't.
human being.
They see him as the other.
One thing they did allude to that the perception was broadened when they left the town, when they went outside the town, because the perceptions were so locked, because a lot of these people have never really left the region. You know, all they see and all they hear are other people like themselves. And they said when they got out of that, or someone traveled out, there was a different perception because they got the world view. not the small shenandoah. As beautiful as it was toxic, you know. But they were trying to keep something alive that had died, unfortunately.
To piggyback on a couple of comments about capitalism and about empathy, and sort of your question about so what, you know, what's the solution about if there is this intergroup bias that exists. So just thinking about how identity is created and what are the, like looking at our educational system, how often is emotion, and I know that there's been studies on this, emotion actually a part of schooling that's not traditionally learning about emotional intelligence. Liz and I teach at a school where acting with empathy is one of our school values. And so that's part of that's the language in the hallways, you know, are you like, you know, you made a decision to not act with empathy, you know, what happened? And so I think that's a way to build a group identity or that values something that promotes inclusion, I guess. But it's complex.
Someone else had their hand up over there. Wasn't there someone right here? Anyway, yeah.
One of the activities I've done in 8th grade is to have the kids do a family tree, a family history as much as they can. And one of the points they are to include is at which level did the family come to the United States, immigrate, and try to tell their story as much as they can. And I think they really learn a lot, and one of the things when they share it all is they all did this. You know, Italians in 1905 were jumping ship in New York because there was no money back in Italy. They had to send it back. And how similar we all are. And I remember there was one kid who brought in a scroll. He could trace his family back to the year 1000 because they lived in the same town in South Korea for 1,000 years.
Wow.
And then we got into how we change so much, how we move around so much, and how it's harder. But it brings out a lot of stuff about what we all share in our stories, our family histories, you know? We're not that different.
One thing actually that just made me thinking back to your comment, I saw this thing a while ago and it was about how a lot of studies are done on American college students or Western Europeans, and that we're actually very strange. Americans are very strange compared to the average human being. We're real outliers in our conceptions of things. I don't remember all the details now, but it was sort of interesting. And so to base all of these psychological concepts on Americans can be a little bit misleading because we are strange people in a world context. We like ourselves because we're part of our group. Oh, great. I don't want to keep you over time because I know people probably have to get in traffic and all of that fun stuff, but I really appreciate you coming. I think it was a really interesting day. I hope it was interesting for you. I'll try to follow up. If you have articles or things that you want me to forward to the group, I can do that, things that you think would fill out this discussion a little bit more. And I'll try to see if I can get in touch with David Turnley and see if there's any way you can get your hands on the film. And if not, we'll figure out some kind of checkout system. We'll send, one more thing, we'll send you an evaluation in a week or so online. We really appreciate it if you fill it out. So, thank you. Thank you.